Its motto is "Let the people rule." Its flower, the apple blossom, and the state bird is the mockingbird. It was the 25th state to join the Union, and it's the state of Arkansas. This is Your America, a series of unrehearsed discussion programs with some little-known and some well-known historical facts and figures on the 50 states of the Union. Clark Kinnaird, author and award-winning historian, is the guest, and the moderator is C.G. Wells. Now, the 25th state to join the Union, Arkansas.
Well, Clark, let's start off as we usually do by defining the name of the state. How did Arkansas get the name of Arkansas?
This name, which denoted an Indian tribe near the mouth of the Arkansas on the Mississippi, a tribe that was probably the Quapaw, Q-U-A-P-A-W, was translated by Marquette as Arkansas, and thus it appeared first on a Marquette map in 1673. Of course, Marquette came along about a century after De Soto had been there with the Spanish expedition. There were much dispute in subsequent years about the proper pronunciation of it, whether it was Arkansas or Arkansas. And finally, in 1881, the legislature passed a law providing for an official and legal pronunciation of it. And the resolution said that the only true pronunciation of the name of the state is that received from the native Indians by the French and committed to writing, and that should be pronounced with the final S silent, the A with the Italian sound, and the accent on the first and last syllables, being the pronunciation formally universal and still commonly used.
During the 1849s, I think, Clark, Arkansas was the jumping-off place for California, wasn't it?
Well, Fort Smith, which was near the headwaters of the Arkansas River, was a literal jumping-off place, perhaps second in importance to St. Louis. The Arkansas River, which cuts up from the Mississippi River and goes towards California, towards the Santa Fe Trail, I should say, was an important river of commerce during the opening of the Far West, because the French had themselves favored the river as a mode of travel rather than roads or mountains, and of course it cut off miles of space for them. And since the settlements had been built up along this river, naturally the person seeking gold followed this route and into the Santa Fe Trail and took the southern route into California, the southern route being the better one for travel to California in those days.
You also mentioned De Soto, and I think De Soto and his men were the first ones to come across.
Well, De Soto came into this territory where he had come up from Florida with an extensive expedition of priests, of cattle, of settlers, looking for gold, and similar to the finds that had been made in the Spanish in Peru and in Mexico. He did not find it, but in the course of looking for it, he crossed the Mississippi River, perhaps the first European to do so, at about St. Helena, Arkansas, and stayed in this region for several months. During this time, members of his expedition found the Arkansas River and were the first to explore it. They went from the Arkansas River then down into Louisiana and disappeared from the history of Arkansas in that fashion. Now, that whole region, of course, being a part of Louisiana Purchase, was interchangeably Spanish and French up until the time of the Louisiana Purchase. After the first settlements, however, had been made by the French back in about 1673 at Arkansas Post, which was at the outlet of the Arkansas River. They did not do much developing of it. It was permanently settled during the time of John Law's Mississippi Company, the so-called Mississippi Bubble time, when he set aside about 12 square miles at the confluence of the Arkansas into a duchy. And he induced about 600 Germans and French to come over into this region and establish a colony. It was not the Indians were very hostile to them. They were ill-suited to colonize this region, and that colony died out. So there was no extensive development of Arkansas until the Louisiana Purchase. At the time of the Louisiana Purchase, Arkansas had a population of about 1,000. It was then, of course, a part of Missouri. The two were separated about 1819, up to that time, Arkansas had been a county of Missouri called the District of New Madrid. Then it was set apart as a territory of its own about 1821, at which time the population was 14,255. It became a state in 1836, as you know. It's almost 53,000 square miles, and incidentally, if you look on the map, Arkansas is almost square in its conformation.
Arkansas has the only diamond mine in North America. Is there a story behind that?
Well, that was discovered at a very early time, and there are various stories connected with why it was not fully developed. One of them, of course, was that the De Beers Syndicate of South Africa didn't want it developed and prevented it being developed by making Arkansas diamonds appear to be low grade in the world market. That's a fantastic idea, because actually the diamond mine was, no mine down there has ever been found that was as extensive in its potential as the diamond mines of Africa. As you say, some of the diamonds are used industrially. One man who owned a diamond owned acreage in which there were indubitably diamonds, but of small character, was in the habit of letting persons come there and dig so much per day, and they got all the diamonds that they discovered, and this was quite an attraction for a while. But of course, most persons don't want to be there digging for a whole week and not find a diamond, so it didn't get to be too popular.
Well, Clark, we can't skip over Arkansas without mentioning something about the MacArthur family. Do you have some information?
Well, as I recall, General MacArthur was not there very long. He was born in Arkansas simply because his father, General Arthur MacArthur, happened to be stationed at that time in Arkansas. I believe he was taken, the father was transferred at an early time to Wisconsin, and that General MacArthur, life was more associated with Wisconsin than with Arkansas. I think they'll probably preserve his birthplace in Arkansas now, and Arkansas has observed General MacArthur's birthday as a holiday. But I don't think he's generally associated with the state of Arkansas. I think the most famous Arkansas citizen, or resident, or dweller, is of course the figurative character in that famous old folklore tradition called the Arkansas Traveler, which is probably unknown to most persons today, but it was the practical foundation of the mountain music that is today enormously popular and has gone around the world. And in the Arkansas Traveler, which has about as many verses as the Mademoiselle from Armentières, a traveler comes along, perhaps on his way to California, on his way to Santa Fe, and he finds sitting in front of a tavern which has no roof, a man fiddling. So he asks him, this traveler does, where does this road go? And the stranger is told, it ain't never gone anywhere since I've been here, the man announced. So then the traveler asked him why the tavern had no roof on it. And he said, well, when it's raining, I can't fix it. And when it ain't raining, I don't need it. The song consists of questions and answers of that kind, and goes on an interminative all the while to the saw of this violin, which was much imitated by the subsequent travelers of that time. Now, Arkansas had many other folk tales associated with bear hunting, because when the settlers came into the Ozark regions, they were heavily infested with bears, and many a man got his first bear there, and many of the tales associated with Davy Crockett and other frontier heroes had their origin in the bear tales of Arkansas. In those days, you were just nobody if you hadn't fitten with a bear, and if you didn't have a knife similar to the knives that they got in Missouri and used as toothpicks.
I understand they used to have trouble with the Prohibition agents up there in the Ozark Mountains, too.
Oh, yes. I believe that the moonshining still goes on extensively in the Ozarks.
Don't mention it. Well, Clark, let's get back to Fort Smith. They had a famous hanging judge out there, didn't
Fort
they?
Smith was the outpost of law on that western frontier at that time. It was the town or settlement and court closest to Indian Territory, which of course became immediately a refuge for many types of outlaws, and of course outlawry thrived on the Santa Fe Trail. And this famous hanging judge, whose name was Smith, incidentally, believed that if a man was guilty, there was just no point in the government spending money to ship him to a prison in the East, or to let the poor fellow suffer in jail. So it was his habit, when the man was found guilty, to sentence him to be hanged, and I think perhaps more men were hanged by judgment in that court than any other place, and he became a legendary character out there, and of course it became a lawful town because outlaws stayed clear of the jurisdiction of Fort Smith as long as he was there. Eventually the judge himself fell afoul of the law and was defrocked as a judge, but I don't think he was hanged at that time. We must consider the importance of the rivers in connection with Arkansas, CG. It had 3,500 miles of streams that were navigable by the steamboat. And Arkansas had a very small population until the steamboat came along and made the Mississippi and the Arkansas the long-run media of travel into the Southwest. Probably the Arkansas at one time handled as many persons on steamboat as did the Missouri. And it was in that region that they developed the famous snag boat. One of the great achievements of the Army engineers was to build snag boats that came along and extricated from the channels of the steamboats the snags which were whole trees that had been brought down by the spring floods. It was a great achievement for them, and it made the river navigable. Up to that time, before these snag boats were evolved, many boats struck the snags and were sunk in that river.
Arkansas was the 24th state to join the Union.
It's the 25th state. It's the 20th. I say it's the halfway point.
And I was wondering, were there any problems behind it becoming a state?
No problems whatsoever. It had subsequent problems, of course, in 1861 to 65 because of the Civil War. Fortunately, the principal battles were over by 1862 and 63 because of the success of the Army and of the Navy. The Navy came up and took took Arkansas Post, and that closed off the Mississippi at that point, and also closed off the Arkansas River to the Confederates. So that cut off a large source of their cotton. Cotton, of course, was a very important product in the history of the Arkansas, and that was the original attraction for it. Now, one other thing about Arkansas was that in the very early days, enormous settlements, enormous plots of land were obtained by foreign capitalists, and Arkansas had some of the largest cotton plantations in the world, under thousands of acres, and they were owned by British and French and others. It was English milling companies that assured themselves of cotton for their mills by buying it over there.
Did it come in as a slave state or a free state?
Oh yes, it came in as a slave state, of course, because it was below the Mason and Dixon line. And about 90% of the voters of Arkansas, of course, only whites could vote in those days, entered the Confederate Army. After the subjugation of it by the Federal Army, it developed a large number of guerrillas, and they were the spawn of the outlaws, which made the West, the spawn such as Jesse James, the younger brothers knows, had their training in the Arkansas in the 64 and 65.
Thank you very much, Clark Kinnaird.
This has been Your America with Clark Kinnaird, writer, historian, and winner of 3 Freedom's Foundation Awards. The moderator was C.G. Wells.
This is the United States Armed Forces Radio and Television Service.